We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Typically around this time of year, we would be asking about we'd ask the government to update the House on the summer tourism season. Specifically around this time of year, we would tend to ask the government about the passenger loads on the Nova Scotia to Maine ferry. So I'd like to ask the Premier today, could the Premier provide the House with an update on the number of passengers who have used the CAT ferry during the 2019 sailing season?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Premier, Mr. Speaker, thanks very much for the question from the Leader of the Official Opposition. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, we have followed 2 consecutive record tourism seasons for the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member knows that the numbers were put out more recently. There was, for a period of time, the numbers were down about 2%. What he would also know, his railing against the Yarmouth ferry, we've seen room nights down over 30% since the ferry has not been operating, Mr. Speaker, which says clear indication the important role that service plays. And it's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that the Leader of the Conservative Party continues to go against those hard-working tourism operators who rely on that service, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the answer is 0. The answer is 0. You can't, the Premier can hide from many things, but he can't hide from that he's let the tourism operators down. We've learned in March that Nova Scotians paid $8.5 million to renovate a ferry terminal in Bar Harbour. In the last couple of days, we've come to learn that Nova Scotians have paid a subsidy of $11.4 million for this season alone. I'd like to ask the Premier, can the Premier tell this House how much is being paid to Bay Ferries in management fees, and if that's included in the $11.4 million?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we continue to appreciate the relationship we've built with Bay Ferries. They've been an operator, Mr. Speaker, that's continued to provide service not only in the Yarmouth region, Mr. Speaker, they also do the ferry in Digby, Mr. Speaker. You would also know they have a global footprint where they provide services across the globe, Mr. Speaker. How fortunate are we that a world-class operator continues to want to work in this province, Mr. Speaker, and we're looking forward to ensuring that service is up and going, Mr. Speaker, so we continue to support the tourism operators in southwestern Nova Scotia and across, no matter how much the Conservative Party continues to rail against the growth in our tourism in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier, former small business person, would realize how rare it is a company could have $11.4 million in revenue. Imagine how many tourism operators, how many companies around this province are fortunate to have $11.4 million in revenue. This is a company that has delivered no service to Nova Scotians and still received $11.4 million. Bay Ferries had set the start of the season for June 21st. They've also set the close of the season for October 15th. That's just 2 weeks away. We've missed 103 sailing days, and yet taxpayers have paid $20 million. That's almost $200,000 for each and every day that the ferry didn't sail, that no passengers were moved. Can the Premier tell this House, will the ferry sail at all in 2019?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, despite the negativity of the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, the optimism that we see in southwestern Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, around the support of that ferry, and the reality, Mr. Speaker, that we believe we have the right operator, Mr. Speaker, we're going to the right community. We will continue to work with them, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that we support the tourism season. We saw what happened, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
What happened, Mr. Speaker?
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable member is suggesting that we're misleading someone in the House. Let's talk about, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member stood in the House on the 27th of September suggesting there are 985 FOI pops in this province, and he suggested 562 were under review. That's absolutely false. There are 1,985 FOI pops. Only 63 related to government, Mr. Speaker. If the honourable member wants to start debating facts in this House and who's misleading the House, check the record, Mr. Speaker. I think he spoke to him about that.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to direct a couple of questions to the Premier about Northern Pulp. 2 weeks ago, it was revealed in court proceedings in connection with the company that the province had entered into an agreement with Northern Pulp to pay hundreds of thousands and perhaps considerably more for costs associated with the company's environmental assessments. Now, these are the court's own words from the decision in that case, which I'll table. Once the province approves under the funding agreement, would there be an about-face that denies approval under the Environment Act? Likely, the contractual approval would facilitate the statutory approvals, end quote. Will the Premier acknowledge that the independence of the environmental assessment system has been brought into question by these payments to Northern Pulp?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable for the question. No, Mr. Speaker, I would not. I want to tell the Honourable member what happens. He knows we are closing Boat Harbour 9 years, 10 months early. We know there's a liability associated with that. We were in negotiations about that liability. The payment that he's referring to is associated with that, Mr. Speaker. But the reality of it is what we did say to the company, that if they are not here operating, they are not going to use just the excuse of Boat Harbour being closed, Mr. Speaker, that we would require them. And we would then have a very different discussion if they leave before that. So, Mr. Speaker, the entire conversation was about our liability associated with Boat Harbour.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
In these same court-filed documents, it was also revealed that it was a contractual stipulation of the province's payments to the company that Northern Pulp would keep these payments secret. The funding agreement, in fact, and I've just tabled also the same documents that this comes from, Mr. Speaker, in fact says that except as required by law, regulatory or judicial authority, Northern Pulp shall keep private and confidential and not make public or divulge this agreement, end quote. Will the Premier then explain why his government insisted that its payments to the company be kept secret from the people of the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the member for the question. I've said many times, Mr. Speaker, there's a liability associated with closing Boat Harbour early. The government would have a responsibility to deal with that liability. We knew that in 2015. We know that today, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to work with the company and the community about what the actual true cost of that liability will be, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to make sure that we meet all of the obligations associated with our role as government to that project.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, today on Treaty Day, we reflect solemnly on the 52 years through which the people of Pictou Landing have had to endure an endless stream of pollutive effluent running through their backyard, and we reflect also with hope that it is only 121 days until Boat Harbour by law is closed. Will the Premier take the occasion of this final Treaty Day before the Boat Harbour deadline to unequivocally reaffirm that not 1 litre of Abercrombie effluent will flow into Boat Harbour after January 31st, 2020?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the Honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, he would know the legislation that's put before this House. There's a process ongoing around an environmental assessment for the utility, or sorry, for the mill to meet, Mr. Speaker. There has been no, my understanding, there's been no application or approval. We're still moving towards January 31, 2020.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation. The PC caucus learned from a FOIPOP application on the ferry file that under certain circumstances, the operator has the opportunity to earn an additional management fee. Mr. Speaker. This would be on top of the management fee they're earning for not moving the boat at all this summer, I guess, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Transportation. Can you tell this House what might possibly trigger an additional management fee to the operator?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. The PC Party's apparent opposition to this service grows with every setting of the House. In April of 2010, the tourism economy in this province was destabilized when the money was for that service was removed by the government of the day. And further, in 13 of that year, it was additionally destabilized when the ill-fated Nova Star service was put in place by the government of the day. We are committed to stabilizing this service. We know that it is very important for the people of Nova Scotia and of Southwest Nova, and we are committed to having it sail.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, apparently the commitment was that it didn't need to sail at all 2019. That's not supporting the tourism industry. This entire government has let the tourism industry down. I didn't hear an answer on what the trigger might be. Now, it's entirely possible, because I've watched the minister's management of this file, it's entirely possible he just doesn't know. But he should know. $11.4 million in an operating subsidy for a ferry that isn't operating and probably won't operate at all this year. And that's just the subsidy as it stands today, without any additional management fee on top of that, which now we know the operator is somehow entitled to earn an additional management fee. This is the type of mismanagement that happens when the government takes their eyes off a file. Can the minister at least tell this House if the operator is eligible for any additional management fee this year, and if they have or will receive that additional fee?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has called into question the integrity of a minister, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind you again, I want to remind him again, he did this last week, Mr. Speaker, there were 1,985 FOI pops, only 63 that went back related to government, not the 562 that he said. And Mr. Speaker, I want you to check the record again, Mr. Speaker. Who in this House has been told they've misled the House and had to apologize, Mr. Speaker? It has not been the Minister of Transportation. It has been the Leader of the Official Opposition, Mr. Speaker. Just put it on the record, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Last week, Halifax Council released the proposal for a sports stadium in Shannon Park, submitted by Schooner Sports and Entertainment. One of the funding assumptions included in the report is payments from the Government of Nova Scotia in the range of $3 to $4 million per year for 30 years, or up to $120 million. Mr. Speaker, is this a cost the Premier is prepared to pay?
The Honourable The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as she rightly corrected, Mr. Speaker, there's been a proposal put before HRM Council. They're reviewing that, Mr. Speaker. We as a government have also received that. I haven't seen the proposal myself. What I have been on the record as saying there will be no general revenue going into that sports stadium. What I did say, if there are other revenue sources, which I believe the report indicates there are a couple of others, potential possibilities, we would look at those in the totality of the economic footprint of what it might do.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has said many times that he could create new revenue streams to support building a stadium. If there is new money to be found, the people of Dartmouth North need affordable housing, not a stadium. Between 2014 and 2017, rents in the HRM rose by 19%, outpacing any increase in incomes. The proposal provided to Halifax Council points out that a stadium could in fact make housing in that area more expensive. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier agree that it would be better to spend $120 million to help the 1 in 5 households in HRM who are struggling to pay the rent than on a stadium?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. Mr. Speaker, we continue year after year to spend money on affordable housing. We will continue to do so to make that investment. She would know. Mr. Speaker, we've continued to see employment opportunities, job creation, Mr. Speaker, for citizens across the province. Our unemployment rate is at an all-time low, Mr. Speaker. More young people are coming back into this province, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member is right on her position, Mr. Speaker, that we need to continue to invest in affordable housing. We need to continue to invest in health care. But, Mr. Speaker, we also need to drive the economy of this province and work with the private sector. So when we see an economic opportunity come to this province, it is the responsibility of the government, Mr. Speaker, if they're being asked to partner with that, to have an assessment of that and look at the overall economic footprint. The New Democratic Party is opposed to growing the footprint of the economic future of this province, Mr. Speaker. We saw what happened, Mr. Speaker, when they were in power. The economy got ignored. More people left, Mr. Speaker. What we're seeing now, unemployment going down. There's more people coming, Mr. Speaker. We're on the right track, and we'll look at all economic opportunities being applied out.
The The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation, or I'll take the Premier, whichever one wants to give the same talking points. The Minister of Business has said that they have the best possible option for operating this ferry on the planet, the best operator on the planet. If I were a shareholder, I'd probably agree. $11.4 million and not one single customer. The ferry was slated to begin on June 21st, later postponed to July 7th, and then again to July 15th, and ultimately postponed maybe indefinitely. The government has said as recently as September 12th, though, that they're still hoping for at least one crossing. My question for the minister: how has Bay Ferries managed its crew? Have they been kept on standby, or have they been laid off?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. The costs associated with maintaining the service are baked into the arrangements that we have with the company in terms of how the service operates. As it's been made public at public accounts, all the expenditures associated with this service are made available to the public through that process, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously there's a lot of costs baked into this. The boat hasn't moved once, and it's $11.4 million. We have to go to court to figure out exactly how much is baked into that cake, Mr. Speaker. But I believe the ferry has made possibly one empty run to Bar Harbor. But we've previously learned that the crew of the CAT is, by law, an entirely American crew. The ferry has been in Yarmouth for virtually the entire not sailing season. With an American-based crew and a ship in Canada, one is left to wonder, where were these crew members staying the entire time? I'd like to ask the minister, can the minister clarify for this House whether the crew has been staying in Yarmouth or whether Bay Ferries has been flying them back and forth?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, in the Leader of the Conservative Party's preamble, he said you had to go to court to find that information. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, every penny that has been spent on the Yarmouth to Bar Harbor ferry, Mr. Speaker, has been documented for the public to see, Mr. Speaker. That is misleading the House, Mr. Speaker, once again. What he's talking about, Mr. Speaker, let's be clear, is the Conservative Party taking a private company to court to find their management team to destabilize their competitive place in a global marketplace, Mr. Speaker. That's what he's talking about, Mr. Speaker. But every dime that has been spent on that service, Mr. Speaker, has been made public in public accounts to the people of Nova Scotia, not as the leader just described it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, at some point the government's going to have to look in the mirror on this particular file and take some accountability and accept some responsibility for an entire sailing season missed at the cost of $20 million. Documents disclosed in a FOIPOP indicate that someone, may have been the operator, may have been the government, because it was redacted, we couldn't tell, someone asked for an extension of the option to return to Portland. And despite having been in contact with Bar Harbor from as early as June 2018, Bay Ferries was still asking Portland as late as January 2019 if they could go back. Obviously, it was clear in January that the ball was being dropped in Bar Harbor, and they knew that since June before. My question for the minister is, clearly things had not progressed between June 2018 and January 19. Why did he ever believe that there was any chance for the boat to sail this season?
The Honourable Premier.
So, Mr. Speaker, again, the Leader of the Conservative Party is making a big assumption. At the beginning of his question, he said he didn't know, and then he relayed that comment to Bay Ferries. The answer to the question is he doesn't know, Mr. Speaker. He's making a big stretch, Mr. Speaker. Again, let's be accurate if he's going to ask questions in the House of Assembly.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
A little bit of accuracy in the answers would go a long way, Mr. Speaker. Somebody redacted it. Somebody knew in June and in January and in November in between that there was a big, big problem with Bar Harbor. And this government likes to push that failure on everybody but themselves, Mr. Speaker. certainly not the best possible operator on the planet. They can't be responsible for anything. First, it was the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. Then it was Donald Trump's shutdown. Then it was Portland because they wouldn't let them back in. Lots of blame being pointed all around, Mr. Speaker, but the reality is the 2019 season was in jeopardy as early as June 2018, and the extension requests to Portland are evidence of that. My question for the Minister of Transportation, can you tell this House who is actually responsible for an entire missed sailing season?
The Honourable Premier.
And, Mr. Speaker, for accuracy, Mr. Speaker, that ferry was never returned into Portland, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, there were changes when it came to border security on both borders, Mr. Speaker, the one in the southern tip of the U.S., Mr. Speaker, and the northern border related to us. It impacted Portland, Mr. Speaker. They did not want that ferry service into Portland, Mr. Speaker. They were clear about that. We've entered into a relationship with Bar Harbor, Mr. Speaker, but let's be accurate, Mr. Speaker. Let's make sure when the honourable member stands up, he at least tries to put the facts on the table, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Pretty rich, Mr. Speaker. Pretty rich. It's becoming increasingly difficult to get any kind of an answer from this government on the ferry file. The Minister and the Premier seem only interested in parroting the talking points that they think will get them out of a jam at that particular moment. There's little indication of any meaningful oversight on this file. I can't see that anyone is overseeing this file, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister. When Bay Ferries came to him on June 7th and said they were cancelling reservations up to July 7th, did the Minister ask for a detailed project plan or any information that would give him comfort that the season would in fact start on July 7th?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure my learned colleague on the other side, with his training, would understand that, of course, intensive financial analysis are being done constantly around this file. And all aspects of the service are being analyzed. And the only thing that's been constant throughout this debate over the last number of years has been the opposition to this service and to the people of Southwest Nova by the party opposite. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, despite the intense analysis that was, of course, being done by this government, just 2 weeks later, the plan went off the rails yet again. And the government came back and said, the operator came back, the government agreed, whatever the case may be, wasn't going to be July 7th. It was then being pushed to July 18th. So my question for the Minister is, despite the obvious intensive analysis that was done just 2 weeks before, when the operator came back yet again and said there's yet another delay, did the Minister ask for any information that would give him comfort that this time it might actually sail on July 18th as he was being instructed? Any analysis that time?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Yes.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's sad, because yet a week later, yet again, the sailing season was postponed, this time indefinitely. 3 times in a row. And this government said, despite their intense analysis, continued to be delayed. It's not good enough, Mr. Speaker. $20 million of taxpayer money, it is not good enough. If the Minister would have asked the correct questions way back in early July when the first postponement was coming, tourism operators might have had a chance as they looked at their season, whether to staff up. They might have had some insight as to where this was going. So my question for the Minister is, when was the last time the Minister actually went to Bar Harbor to see how much left is work on the Bar Harbor terminal building?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have officials at Bar Harbor continuously. We have a consultant, a third-party consultant that has been hired throughout the whole process to monitor the project as it has moved forward. And we have complete faith in Bay Ferries, their ability to manage that file and to create the sustainable service that is going to serve Nova Scotia for decades into the future.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is My question is for
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. It's becoming increasingly agitating to listen to the responses from this government on this file. On the one hand, there's a $1.75 million announcement on the eve of a by-election. 4 cabinet ministers show up. On the other hand, we have $20 million of taxpayer money, and nobody is going down to check on it. The minister's looking at video. $11.4 million subsidy for the season, nothing to show for it, not one passenger. Not one room night sold, not one Nova Scotian job. It's an utter failure to manage this file. I'd like to ask the Premier, does the Premier think his minister has done an adequate job in safeguarding $20 million of public money?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member asks a question, Mr. Speaker should listen to the answer. The Minister of Transportation has just said we've had officials down there, Mr. Speaker. The Deputy Minister's down there. We've had other members of our TIR staff who've been down there, Mr. Speaker, multiple times to look at this project as we continue to see this project go forward. I understand the question might have been written to him before he started to ask it, Mr. Speaker, but the reality is he should listen if he wants to the answer that is provided.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for housing. In my office, I have heard from people who have faced rent increases large enough to force them to move, only to learn afterwards that the landlord has turned their old home into a more profitable Airbnb. I hear from people looking for housing who are considering exorbitantly priced basement apartments in neighborhoods where they have never considered living before because Airbnbs have eaten into the residential rental stock. And in conversations with municipal leaders across the province, I've heard that tourism workers are having a hard time finding a place to live. It's clear to me that we have waited too long to regulate. Mr. Speaker, when will this government regulate short-term rentals and return some much-needed fairness to the housing market in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Housing, Nova Scotia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, this government believes that every Nova Scotia deserves a safe and affordable place to call home. Mr. Speaker, as the member may be aware, and all members of this House, we just signed the National Housing Strategy off in August. That's worth more than $400 million in the next decade to this province, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to invest in a variety of ways to meet the housing needs of all Nova Scotians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, none of those units through that national housing agreement are going to make a difference for families looking for housing now in our communities. Nova Scotians are in a housing crisis. Across the province, short-term rentals are one factor that has reduced the rental housing stock available for residents, for families, for our constituents. We need strong regulations to curb this impact on our communities so that Nova Scotians are still able to find a place to live that they can afford. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell Nova Scotians how the impending regulations will bring properties back into the long-term rental market?
The Honourable Minister of Housing, Nova Scotia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The National Housing Strategy will indeed have a large impact on where we are going into the future. More than $400 million being invested. This year, the action plan alone, $88 million being invested between the two levels of government, with an additional $70 million being invested by the province alone. This will help more than 5,500 households in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Last year, more than 500 new rent supplements were assigned to individuals. We'll be talking about more of those in the coming years, and we'll be doing all we can to assist those right across this province looking for housing, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Mr. Speaker, during the recent by-election in Argyle-Barrington, the Liberal candidate was adamant that in stating only this government could protect tourism in the Yarmouth and Acadian Shores area. But we learned last week that they might need to work a little bit harder in protecting tourism providers. In July, licensed room nights sold in the area were down 29% over July 2018, compared to an overall provincial decline of 1%. And year-to-date, room nights in the area to the end of July 2019 were down 22% compared to the provincial decline of 2%. My question for the Minister of Transportation: why are business operators in Yarmouth County and Shelburne County being left to shoulder the fallout of this government's mismanagement?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Obviously, the impact of the Yarmouth to Bar Harbour to Portland Ferry has had significant effect on the operators down in the South Shore, and quite frankly, all regions of all Nova Scotia, including Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. This is why, from day one, from the beginning, we fought for the ferry before we were in government. We fought to correct what happened with the Nova Star and the mess that made. We do have the best operator. We've worked tirelessly to get the best agreement, the best possible situation. What's happened is certainly regrettable, Mr. Speaker. We want the ferry to be running. Jump with us, get in line, and let's make sure that ferry has a great season in 2020.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Mr. Speaker, in July, the Tri-County Vanguard ran an article with the headline, and I quote, "Ferry delay impacting Yarmouth tourism stakeholders heavily." In it, the owner of the Lakelon B&B and Motel in Yarmouth stated 80% of his business had been cancelled through the early July. The owner of the Best Western in Yarmouth called the impact of the lost ferry, and I quote, "devastating." The owner of McKinnon Inn said the situation was, and I quote, "depressing," and that the inn was forced to refund multiple cancelled reservations. And I will table all of this for the government side, the self-appointed sole protectors of tourism in Yarmouth. So my question again is, can these operators expect some support, or is the ferry the only business that isn't allowed to lose money?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Without question, without a second of hesitation, I'm very proud of our economic record for rebuilding the economy of Nova Scotia here. I know that this is a serious question for the member, and it is for all members of this legislature. We know that tourism is an economic pillar for this province, Mr. Speaker. That's why we've invested more than any government and are leading the Federation in the work for direct flights. That's why we invest directly in tourism icons, Mr. Speaker. That's why we've supported Tourism Nova Scotia through robust marketing, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we will continue to support a strong Yarmouth Ferry service, because when that service goes, it impacts positively all tourism operators in Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last fall, we asked this government if a new nicotine vaping product sweeping the United States was available here in Nova Scotia. The Minister of Justice indicated he wasn't sure, but that he would work with the Minister of Health and Wellness to review the issue and determine the availability of such products in Nova Scotia, and I'll table that. As concerns have grown in recent months over the long-term effects of vaping, I'd like to follow up and ask the Minister of Health what conclusions of nicotine vaping devices were drawn from the sit-down meeting between him and his colleague.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Of course, both the department, I believe all members in the legislature obviously have concerns with both smoking rates and the rise of vaping or e-cigarette use. In particular, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to our youth population, we certainly know of concerns being raised about youth rates of smoking. We've seen this. I have the Office of Medical Health, the Chief Medical Health Officer, continues to evaluate and monitor to provide advice and recommendations, Mr. Speaker, about any future changes with respect to these products.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer, although I don't think they met actually, which concerns me. But as the Minister would know, Health Canada issued an advisory on the weekend that warned Canadians on vaping products to monitor their symptoms for pulmonary illness. This comes in the wake of increased media reports on severe pulmonary illness and even death related with vaping in the United States. This month, vaping-related hospitalizations were confirmed in Ontario, BC, Quebec, and with other cases under review, and I'll table that document. Yet when we raised this issue a year ago, there was little concern or awareness. So does the Minister now agree that this province is absolutely not immune to the growing vaping-related health problems we're seeing in other jurisdictions?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for bringing this topic to the floor. Indeed, a topic of interest and concern, not just for us on the floor of the legislature, but I believe for Nova Scotians more broadly. Mr. Speaker, of course, the health concerns and these reports about respiratory illnesses that are occurring and being reported and investigated both throughout the United States and more recently a few cases here in Canada. I can assure the member that we do take this very seriously. Collectively as a government, I can table this document, Mr. Speaker. My colleague, the Minister of Finance, also engaging with public health nationally in terms of where their positioning is on regulation and changes in regulation. Mr. Speaker, through the department, the Public Health Office, they've engaged both their national partners, but also, Mr. Speaker, engaging frontline healthcare professionals, providing advice and recommendation on how to monitor, as well as reports so we can get an appreciation and understanding for what, if any, health impacts and respiratory illnesses being derived in our province. So that work is ongoing.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. The Lung Association of Nova Scotia reports that 37% of our youth in grades 7 through 12 have tried an e-cigarette at least once. That's a rate 61% higher than the same rate among all Canadian students in the same grade range, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. A review of the Twitter account for the department returns not a single instance of the terms vape, vaping, or e-cigarette. And the extent of advocacy on the matter from the largest regional education centre in the province seems to be a two-page handout sheet distributed to parents. And I'll table that as well, Mr. Speaker. My question is this. Does the minister feel that a handout sheet is a sufficient tool to discourage students from trying vaping products? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, vaping is not allowed on school property. It is punishable, including consequences up to suspension. We inform our students through our healthy curriculum on the dangers of vaping, and we update that curriculum to make sure that all the information is accurate. This year, we did reach out to parents as well to enhance the effort that we're doing to inform our students of the dangers of vaping, so that students can not just have a conversation about this important situation in school, but also at home with their parents.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, the minister claims that the curriculum is helping students make healthy decisions about vaping, but a conversation with any of our principals will tell you that this is an ongoing problem at our schools and that clearly there's a disconnect. The outcomes that we have about vaping are clearly not helping some of our youth make healthy choices. Medical professionals continuously warn us that we do not know the long-term effects of vaping. And that's part of what's so concerning about these high rates of experimentation with the devices among youth. We know pneumonia-like symptoms have been reported among heavy vape users, and manufacturers can freely advertise fun flavors that attract young customers. Now, when we previously asked the minister about this question, the question was brushed aside. My question now is this. Will the minister admit that the department's response at this point is not sufficient in the face of a growing danger to young Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This question has never been brushed aside. This is a critical question for the Department of Education, for the Department of Health, and indeed the entire government. We want our citizens, our students, to know the dangers of vaping. That's why in education we ensure that it's in our curriculum. We train our teachers on this very issue, and we're also bringing in parents to have a conversation here. The best thing we can do in our education system, Mr. Speaker, is empower our students to make decisions for themselves. We can't control their decisions, but we have to be able to educate them so they can make the best decisions for their lives and their bodies. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the physiotherapy department at the Cobequid Health Centre currently has the largest wait list in the province, numbering 771. This physiotherapy department has a catchment area that serves the area of Mount Uniacke, Stewiacke, Clayton Park, Rockingham, and of course Sackville. It receives between 125 and 150 new referrals a month and has only 4 physiotherapists on staff to handle this new wait list. It's my understanding, Mr. Speaker, that in comparison, the Memorial Building in Halifax sees less referral volume but has twice the physiotherapists on staff to handle their volume. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, will the Minister commit to either hiring or reassigning additional physiotherapists to Cobequid to better address the growing wait list?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's question. I think it's important to recognize the investments that we've made as a government towards improving access to care, in particular, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to both pre- and post-rehabilitation, Mr. Speaker, for those in particular with joint issues and requiring a surgery. Mr. Speaker, the orthopedic strategy and the investments we've made there have seen an expansion of clinic supports and investments, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that people are prepared, have better outcomes based upon those services, requiring less time in those rehabilitative services after their surgeries, Mr. Speaker. So we continue to invest, looking at and evaluating the entire system, Mr. Speaker, of delivering these type of care for all Nova Scotians in need.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that new referrals received by Cobequid Physiotherapy Department are all assigned a category depending on the patient's needs. Urgent is within 7 days, P1 is within 2 to 3 weeks, or 1 to 2 weeks. A P2 could be between 2 and 4 weeks, and generally it would probably be about 4 to 8 weeks. However, we're told by a constituent who was provided the classification of a P2 due to her chronic pain, but it's now been over 2 years, not 2 to 4 weeks. The Cobequid Health Centre has informed them that it could be another 2 years yet until they get in. Why is it that the department can't adhere to its own classification policy instead of making people wait for months and years?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's concern, particularly being brought forward on behalf of a constituent. A few things to address in the question. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, it's not the department's policy or rating structure, Mr. Speaker. It's part of the Nova Scotia Health Authority, Mr. Speaker. That's the operational arm that delivers the health care services in our communities across the province. So, Mr. Speaker, the Health Authority works to ensure that the health care services in our hospital and in our communities throughout the province are being delivered. Mr. Speaker, what I would encourage the member, if he has a specific constituent with those concerns, if he's raised with the local site, he can certainly reach out to the Health Authority as patient advocates available to help navigate the system, provide clarity. And Mr. Speaker, if that doesn't provide appropriate resolution, he can certainly bring up the conversation with me as well.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week we saw an emergency debate on climate change in this House, and also in April of 2019 we saw the royal assent of the Coastal Protection Act. And the Act is supposed to be for preventing the development and activity in certain locations adjacent to the coast. What I'm really concerned about, Mr. Speaker, is the actual development that already exists there, and in particular public infrastructure in the way of roads and bridges. I would like to ask the Minister of the Environment what role does his department play and that he plays in putting together a plan to make certain that our coastal infrastructure that's publicly owned is protected in the years to come.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for my questions here today. We first want to really recognize the fact that Nova Scotians certainly we're leaders in climate change and the work that we're doing not only to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but this work that she's mentioned in coastal protection is an extremely important part of it in mitigating those effects that are coming. Yes, it is an emergency. We recognize that. I'm very proud of the work that we're doing collectively with the Department of Municipal Affairs and building the regulations around what that Act actually will touch on. And in the future, as we roll those regulations out, certainly we'll be able to provide that information from what we hear from Nova Scotians and what's important to them. And again, that certain important part that we have in protecting Nova Scotia, which is in fact itself an island. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to redirect my supplementary to the Minister for TIR. I already have an emergency, I can assure you, in my constituency, and I'm sure that I am not the only one that has, in any time that we have a storm like the hurricane that we just had, we have breakwaters that should be protecting our roadways, which are provincially owned. They are obviously a federal responsibility, but at the end of the day, if they're not kept in good working order, it affects the coastal roadways, and we have several situations in my constituency where roads are actually at risk of washing away with a storm surge. Can I ask the minister, please, what plan does he have in place in order to protect our transportation infrastructure as climate change obviously is becoming more and more of an emergency situation?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I really appreciate the question. Thank the member opposite for the question, because it gives me an opportunity to publicly thank all the 2,200 employees of TIR who worked diligently providing relief during Dorian. I've received emails from across the province thanking the department for the selfless work that was done during that during the hurricane. I really want to thank our staff for doing that. In terms of protecting our coastal resources and highways, that is something that we do constantly. And also, as the member might know, municipalities are responsible for having EMO plans for protecting their coastal areas. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Speaker, a question for the Minister of Finance. Refer to the letter that the Minister of Health just tabled with respect to vaping. The question for the Minister of Finance, does this suggest that the government is in fact concerned with the revenue impact of the future sale of cannabis vaping products, given the federal government in October of this year will be regulating that marketplace?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite, that it couldn't be further from the truth. We've said here in this House that our main concern is the safety of youth and children, and we continue to be driven by that. The request to the Minister of Health, the Federal Minister of Health, was guidelines, because we will be, through NSLC, the retailer when other products come online. And we wanted to raise the concern that is there both globally and locally with the health hazards of vaping. And that's the intent of the question, and it was direction from the Minister.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the first thing I would say, if this government is concerned about the health impacts, why didn't the letter come from the Minister of Health? The other point would be, if we look at the letter, there's no specific reference made to health. There is some concern about consumption of cannabis through vaping. But, Mr. Speaker, it appears that the government is more interested in wanting to know if they can buy something so that then retailers can resell it.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are three departments that work together closely on this side of the House with respect to cannabis and cannabis products: Justice, Health, and Finance. It is the Federal Minister of Health. It is Health Canada that set the guidelines for what products will be approved. But as the retailer in this province and as the person responsible for NSLC, it's important that I know what products will be approved for retail.
The Honourable Member for Colchester-Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. The Moose River Road in my constituency has been a hazardous road now for a good many years to drive on. With the mine going in Moose River, of course, this road was slated for repairs in 2018 and to be completed in 2019. I know I have checked many times this summer on the progress of the road, and I haven't seen any change from last year to this year. I've tried to ask why. One of the reasons suggested was that the tender went in late. If that's the case, could the minister explain to me that so that I can then explain to my constituents what happened?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member drawing attention to us tendering the longest continuous piece of paving that we have tendered this year in the province at 17 kilometres, all of which is in the member's constituency. You can rest assured that the contract has been awarded, and I believe the work started yesterday.
Thank you very much. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.